Why do we scroll endlessly through our phones the moment we find ourselves alone? Why does silence feel like a threat rather than a sanctuary? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why does the prospect of spending an evening with only our own thoughts fill us with a peculiar kind of dread that we rarely acknowledge but constantly flee from? These questions reveal something profound about the human condition in our current age. We live in an era where being alone has become almost synonymous with being lonely, where solitude is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a space to be inhabited. But this fear, this almost visceral recoil from our own company, is not simply a personal failing or a quirk of individual psychology. It represents something far deeper about how we construct our sense of self and how that construction has been shaped by forces both ancient and modern. To understand why we fear being alone, we must first confront an uncomfortable truth about human identity. We are not, as we often imagine ourselves to be, singular unified beings with a fixed and stable sense of who we are. Instead, each of us is more accurately understood as a collection of selves, a multiplicity of identities that shift and reform depending on who is watching us and who we believe ourselves to be in any given moment. The psychologist William James recognized this over a century ago when he wrote that a person has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him and carry an image of him in their mind. This is not mere philosophical abstraction. Consider how differently you speak, how differently you hold your body, how differently you think when you are with your parents versus your colleagues versus your closest friends versus strangers. These are not simply masks we put on and take off. They are, in a very real sense, different versions of who we are, different manifestations of the self that feel authentic in their respective contexts. The self, in other words, is not a thing but a process, not a noun but a verb, constantly being constructed and reconstructed in response to the social mirrors that surround us. And this is precisely where the problem begins. Because if our sense of self is fundamentally relational, fundamentally dependent on these external mirrors and social contexts, then what happens when we remove those mirrors? What happens when we are truly alone with no audience to perform for, no social role to inhabit, no external validation to confirm that we exist in the way we believe we exist? For many of us, the answer is deeply unsettling. In the absence of these external anchors, the self begins to feel unstable, almost unreal. We experience what might be called ontological vertigo, a dizzying sense that without others to reflect us back to ourselves, we might somehow cease to exist in any meaningful way. The ego, that part of us that mediates between our internal desires and external reality, depends on constant feedback from the world. It needs to see itself mirrored in the responses of others, in the likes and comments and acknowledgments that tell us we are here, we matter, we are real. This dependency on external validation is not a modern invention, but it has been dramatically amplified by the technologies and social structures of our time. We carry devices in our pockets that offer us instant access to an infinite number of social mirrors, each one providing a small hit of recognition, a momentary confirmation that we exist. Every notification, every message, every digital interaction serves as a kind of existential reassurance. And conversely, every moment without such interaction, every stretch of time spent disconnected from this constant stream of validation begins to feel like a kind of death, a fading into irrelevance and non-being. But to truly understand the depth of our fear of being alone, we need to look beyond individual psychology and examine how our relationship with solitude has been shaped by historical and cultural forces. There was a time, not so very long ago, when solitude was not feared but revered, when the ability to be alone with one's thoughts was considered a mark of wisdom and spiritual depth rather than social failure. In ancient philosophical traditions, from the Stoics of Greece and Rome to the Buddhist contemplatives of Asia, solitude was understood as essential to the examined life. Seneca wrote eloquently about the importance of withdrawing from the crowd in order to know oneself. Marcus Aurelius, despite being emperor of Rome, carved out time for solitary reflection, understanding that true wisdom required stepping back from the demands and distractions of social life. The desert fathers and mothers of early Christianity sought out isolation not as punishment but as liberation, as a way to strip away the false selves constructed by society and encounter something more fundamental. Even in more recent centuries, before the Industrial Revolution fully transformed Western society, periods of solitude were woven into the fabric of daily life. Long walks alone, time spent in contemplation, the practice of keeping a private journal, these were all considered normal and valuable activities. Thinkers from Montaigne to Thoreau celebrated solitude as the wellspring of creativity, self-knowledge, and authentic living. Thoreau's retreat to Walden Pond was not an act of misanthropy but a deliberate experiment in discovering what was essential to human existence when stripped of social pretense. So what changed? How did we move from a culture that valued contemplative solitude to one that pathologizes it, that treats being alone as something to be feared and avoided at all costs? The transformation began with industrialization and the rise of mass society. As people moved from rural areas to cities, as work became increasingly specialized and social roles became more rigidly defined, the individual came to be understood primarily through their function in the social machine. Your identity was your job, your social position, your ability to contribute to and participate in the collective enterprise. Solitude, in this context, became economically unproductive, a waste of time that could be better spent in labor or consumption. But the deeper shift occurred at the level of values and meanings. The rise of consumer capitalism in the 20th century required the cultivation of perpetual dissatisfaction, a constant feeling that we are incomplete and need external products, experiences, and relationships to make us whole. Advertising became increasingly sophisticated at creating anxiety about our social standing, our attractiveness, our worth in the eyes of others. And solitude, in this framework, became reframed as loneliness, as a problem indicating that something is wrong with us, that we have failed to achieve the social success that we are told is the measure of a life well lived. The final nail in the coffin came with the digital revolution. Social media platforms, for all their benefits, are fundamentally designed to keep us in a state of constant engagement, constantly checking for updates, constantly comparing ourselves to others, constantly seeking the validation that comes from likes and shares and comments. These platforms have monetized our attention by exploiting our deep-seated need for social connection and our fear of being left out, of missing something important, of being alone while others are together. The result is that we have lost, perhaps more completely than any generation before us, the ability to simply be with ourselves. We have become so accustomed to the constant stimulation, the endless scroll, the perpetual availability of distraction, that silence and solitude now feel not like a respite but like a void, an emptiness that must be filled as quickly as possible. And yet, and this is crucial, the fear we feel is not really a fear of being alone. It is a fear of what we might encounter when we are alone. Because when we remove all the distractions, all the external mirrors and validations and social performances, we're left face to face with the raw material of our own consciousness. We encounter our unexamined thoughts, our suppressed emotions, our unresolved conflicts, the gap between who we pretend to be and who we actually are. The mind, when left to its own devices, does not necessarily offer us pleasant company. Research has shown that people would rather give themselves mild electric shocks than sit alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes. This is not because thinking itself is painful, but because we are so unaccustomed to it, so unpracticed at being with ourselves, that the experience feels alien and uncomfortable. We have not developed the capacity to be good company for ourselves. Moreover, in solitude we confront questions that our busy social lives allow us to avoid. Questions about meaning and purpose, about whether our lives are aligned with our values, about mortality and finitude and the ultimate aloneness of human existence. The existentialists understood this well. Heidegger wrote about anxiety as the experience of confronting our own being, our own radical freedom and responsibility. This anxiety is not something wrong with us but something fundamental to human existence. And it is precisely this anxiety that social life with its rules and roles and routines helps us to avoid. So where does this leave us? Are we condemned to oscillate between the fear of being alone and the exhaustion of perpetual social engagement? Is there no way to reconcile ourselves with solitude, to transform it from something we fear into something we can inhabit peacefully? The answer, I believe, begins with understanding that learning to be alone is not about becoming a hermit or rejecting human connection. It is about developing a different relationship with ourselves, one that does not depend entirely on external validation and social mirrors. It is about cultivating what the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called the capacity to be alone, which he considered one of the most important signs of emotional maturity. This capacity is not innate. It must be developed, practiced, learned, and it begins, paradoxically, with the experience of being alone in the presence of another. As infants, we learn that we can be ourselves, can explore and play and simply exist while a parent or caregiver is present but not demanding our attention. This experience of being alone while not being abandoned teaches us that solitude is not the same as isolation, that we can be with ourselves without losing our connection to others. As adults, we can cultivate this capacity by deliberately creating spaces for solitude in our lives, not as punishment or deprivation, but as a kind of coming home to ourselves. This might mean taking walks without headphones, sitting with a cup of coffee without immediately reaching for our phones, keeping a journal where we can think through our experiences without an audience, or simply allowing ourselves moments of boredom and unstructured time. The key is to approach these moments not as tests we must pass but as opportunities for self-discovery. When difficult thoughts or feelings arise in solitude, the instinct is to reach for distraction. But if we can learn to sit with that discomfort, to observe our thoughts and feelings with curiosity rather than judgment, something remarkable begins to happen. We start to develop what meditation traditions call witness consciousness, the ability to observe our own mental processes without being entirely identified with them. This is liberating because it means that we are not merely the ego that depends on external validation, but something larger that can observe the ego, can see its needs and fears with compassion but not be enslaved by them. We begin to discover that there is a dimension of ourselves that exists independent of social performance, a quiet presence that is there whether anyone else acknowledges it or not. Furthermore, when we develop a genuine capacity for solitude, our relationships with others paradoxically become richer and more authentic. Because we are no longer desperately seeking validation from others to confirm our existence, we can engage with them more freely, more generously, more honestly. We can be truly present with others because we have learned to be present with ourselves. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. While this may be an overstatement, there is a profound truth in it. So much of our suffering comes from our flight from ourselves, from our refusal to confront the reality of our own existence, from our desperate attempts to fill the void with noise and activity and social performance. But the void is not our enemy. The silence is not something to be feared. When we learn to inhabit our solitude, we discover that it is not empty at all but full of possibility, full of the raw material from which a more authentic life can be built. We find that being alone is not the opposite of being connected but the foundation for genuine connection, both with ourselves and with others. The fear of being alone, then, is ultimately a fear of being real, of confronting ourselves without the protective layers of social performance and external validation. And while this confrontation will never be entirely comfortable, while it will always require courage to face ourselves honestly, it is also the path to a kind of freedom that no amount of social success or external validation can provide. It is the freedom to exist on our own terms, to know ourselves, to be at home in our own consciousness regardless of who else is watching or what they might think.